Hi, welcome to the podcast. I'm going to be looking at corporate governance, which is quite a large topic, and I need to be careful not to go into too much detail because I think we just need to keep to the basics for doing an answer in an A-level question. Okay, I've stolen this, to be honest, adapted slightly from Mark Scheme. What is corporate governance? Corporate governance is a mechanism and processes used to control and direct companies in pursuit of their objectives. Involves the rights and responsibilities of the board of directors and managers, and the mechanisms may include monitoring the actions, policies, decisions of companies and their agents. Corporate governance practices will try to align the interests of stakeholders and to minimise conflict in a business. It's quite a mouthful. What I'm going to look at here is what we mean by business processes for making decisions and the role of internal audit within that. Consideration of all stakeholders. So that's not just the consideration of the shareholders, but also looking at things like employees, things like suppliers. Oversight, and this is a key one, I think, really, role of non-executive directors against executive directors. And the fact that overall corporate governance, you would hope, is going to improve profit and decision making and how that happens. Control mechanisms, what we're looking at here is both how the business wants things to happen and how they are making it happen. So information flows, who gets reported about what. So for example, in a large company like Apple, the chief executive wouldn't expect to get reported to him about the fact that there's been a fault on an Apple phone and it's one fault in 100,000 phones that have been sold already. But maybe if there was a fault on 1,000 phones out of the first 100,000 sold, that would be significant. And there needs to be a mechanism that filters that information so the chief executive does get that type of information. Who is responsible for decision making and to what level? So, for example, it's quite common in a company for managers to be allowed to authorise expenditure up to a certain amount, but above that, it perhaps needs to go to their direct manager, and beyond that, maybe their direct manager's direct manager. So, it's how much you're allowed to do, what decisions you can make, what you need to refer up, and how far up an organisation those decisions need to be referred. How information is recorded in a business, so who's responsible for recording it, and then what happens with the information when it's being recorded. There is no point a business just saying X is responsible for recording, for example, the faults on a mobile phone, but then what happens to it? How do we find out within a company like Apple that this fault isn't just affecting a very small number of phones compared to sales, and when it becomes a significant problem? And companies have an audit function that will look at how this sort of process of processing information and decision making is occurring. And that is called internal audit. And it's not just like the old-fashioned external audits that were carried out by auditing accounting firms, but it is looking at processes rather than how much profit or loss a business is making. And interesting, that's something that external auditors now have to look at to a degree to make sure that the business is operating in a professional manner. It also involves division of responsibility. So who is responsible for example, the faults on the mobile phones the company's selling? And part of the control mechanism is ensuring that staff are capable of doing the jobs that they are required to do. Do staff have enough experience? Are staff properly trained? And how can we prove that staff are capable of doing the jobs which are asked of them? In terms of stakeholders, businesses haven't just got a responsibility now in most countries to shareholders, but they do have a wider responsibility to all stakeholders. And this does vary to some extent between different countries. But the general trend is that companies are having to show that they are acting more responsibly in most countries in the world now. So when we're doing internal audit, we should be making sure that a company is making it possible, for example, for disabled staff to contribute and add to the profits of the company, and that they aren't being discriminated against within the business. Gender equality, again, that's something that has become increasingly important. Obviously, years ago, women made up a very small percentage, for example, of the workforce, but it remains a concern that female employees are not, for some reason, rising to the senior levels within a business to the same extent that male employees are. Now, there's two different types of directors within a limited company: executive directors and non-executive directors. And the executive directors are people who are responsible for the day-to-day. They're full-time employees of the company. And for example, the finance director, as the name goes, is quite clearly responsible for the finance side of the business. And they aren't independent. They're not somebody who's going to be able to sit back and say, well, is this company operating as it should do? Because they're involved in the day-to-day issues of the business and not in sort of that broad look at the business that perhaps they ideally would be. And the other type of director that businesses have are non-executive directors. And these are part-time or self-employed people who spend maybe 2 days a month working within the business. But what they're there to do is to make sure that this corporate governance that we've talked about is being followed through by the executive directors and the people below them. So they've got a responsibility to the broader stakeholders, and obviously quite specifically as well to the shareholders, to make sure that this company is operating as it says it's operating, and if it's not, they should be flagging this up as a problem. So they will scrutinise decision making and the processes within the company. And for example, one of the important roles that they do play is looking at management payment and making sure that it's appropriate for the experience and the skills of the managers that a business has, and particularly the directors, and also for their effectiveness. And another advantage as well of non-executive directors, they do bring things in from outside a particular industry. So it's quite common to see people with all manners of backgrounds as non-executive directors of big public limited companies. Okay, the internal audit function, that's not just a financial function. Okay, they normally report to non-executive directors, and it's a check of the process in line with company policy. So do people act within line of the authority they are given, for example, with spending, or are people spending a lot more money than they are authorised to do in the job they are undertaking at that time? Is the information flowing correctly? So if we go back to the mobile phone situation, are more senior managers getting informed when there is clearly a serious problem with a particular mobile phone handset that's just being released? Or is that information taking a long time to get to senior management and not being passed up through the chain as it should do? And are decisions taken correctly? So when people make decisions, are they just making a decision, or are they looking at the impacts of that decision, both on the wider community and all the stakeholders, and also how that might impact the business both today and in the future? And one of the other big things that the internal audit function checks, but it's linked to the other things we've just talked about, are the risks to the business. So some of those risks might be, for example, at the moment, with coronavirus, the risk to the business of a new disease being found. And some of those risks to the business are people acting within their authority and making decisions correctly. So if you look at something like Barings Bank, for example, a trader was clearly going outside his authority when he was making calls in markets that were going to affect the long-term viability of a bank. Corporate governance, why I do it? Well, one of the reasons it's done is it's a legal requirement now in most countries. But the real reasons for it are to making sure that information flows are improved, and well, I haven't put it on the slide, that decision making within the company gets improved. And when we're looking at the flow of information, we're looking at internal information, but also how the business communicates with those external stakeholders as well. Is the information on time? Is it the right information? And is it accurate information? To check a business is working properly, so decisions are being made properly, information is flowing around the business properly, people know what their roles are within a business and they know what's expected of them. And it's also a check on competency. Are people within the business capable of fulfilling the roles which they are currently expected to do? As with most things, there are significant disadvantages. In some businesses, certainly, it's very bureaucratic and it becomes a tick box exercise. And if it becomes too bureaucratic and too time consuming, obviously the whole thing can become very expensive and really of not any benefit to the business. And also, if those sort of processes are not set up correctly and the right information isn't going quickly enough, or in some cases there's too much information flowing, then that can slow down the decision making in process in a company, and it makes them too unresponsive to what's happening. Because the real world, sometimes businesses have to act very, very quickly because businesses aren't always in control of what's happening to them. So again, I'm sitting at the moment in a country where many things have stopped because of coronavirus. Businesses have got to react to that very, very quickly. So, for example, Cathay Pacific had to react, and they got a lot of their crews to take early holidays, and obviously they've had to temporarily suspend people from working so that they can save money. Right. I hope that gives a quick overview of what's required. For students that I'm teaching, there's an essay to do, linked to the slide when I post it, and obviously email me if